The autumn of 1889 brought more than just falling leaves to Millbrook Valley. It brought desperation that settled over the town like morning fog, thick and suffocating. The silver mines that had once promised prosperity now sat empty, their shafts flooding with groundwater and broken dreams. Men who had worked with their hands for decades found themselves staring at calloused palms with nothing to grip, no purpose to fulfill. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, watching the last of the maple leaves spiral down to join the carpet already covering her small yard. The glass was cracked in 3 places, spiderwebbing from a corner where the winter wind had driven a branch against it months ago. She hadn't had the money to fix it then, and she certainly didn't have it now. Behind her, the wooden floor creaked as her daughter Emma moved about the small cabin, sweeping the same patch of dirt that seemed to reappear no matter how many times they cleaned it. The girl hummed softly while she worked, a melody Margaret remembered from her own childhood, back when her mother would sing while kneading bread in a kitchen that always smelled of yeast and hope. Those days felt like someone else's life now. Emma was 17, though she looked older in the way that hardship ages a person prematurely. Her auburn hair caught the weak afternoon light streaming through the damaged window, and her movements held a grace that seemed almost out of place in their humble surroundings. She had her father's steady hands and her mother's determination, though Margaret often wondered if determination alone would be enough to carry them through what lay ahead. The letter sat on the kitchen table like a coiled snake, its formal language and official seal making no attempt to soften the blow it delivered. Final notice, foreclosure proceedings, 30 days to vacate. The words swam together in Margaret's vision, but their meaning remained crystal clear. The small plot of land her husband had bought with his first year's wages from the mine, the cabin he had built with his own hands, the garden where Emma had taken her first steps, all of it would belong to the bank by Christmas. Margaret's fingers traced the edge of the letter, remembering how Thomas had looked when he'd signed the mortgage papers. His eyes had been bright with possibility then, his shoulders squared with the confidence of a man who believed hard work and honest intentions were enough to build a future. He'd been wrong about many things, but he'd been right about one. Emma had grown into something beautiful and strong, something worth protecting. The consumption had taken Thomas 3 years ago, leaving behind a stack of medical bills that had eaten through their savings like wildfire through dry grass. Margaret had sold everything she could, Thomas's tools, her mother's china, even her wedding ring. She'd taken in washing and mending, working her fingers raw, trying to keep up with the interest payments. But the mine closure had been the final blow, eliminating what little income she'd managed to scrape together from the miners' wives, who could no longer afford to pay for laundry services. Emma set down her broom and moved to the stove, checking the thin soup that would serve as their dinner. Margaret watched her daughter's profile, noting the way Emma's cheekbones had become more pronounced over the past months, how her dresses hung looser despite her efforts to take them in. The girl never complained, never spoke of the gnawing hunger that must keep her awake at night, just as it did Margaret. "Mamma," Emma said softly, not turning from the stove, "Mrs. Henderson stopped by while you were at the post office. She said there might be work at the hotel in Riverside City, cleaning rooms, serving in the dining hall." Margaret's heart clenched. Riverside City sat 50 miles north, a growing railroad town where young women went to work and often disappeared, into lives their families never heard about again. The work Emma spoke of was respectable enough, but Margaret knew how quickly respectability could crumble for a girl alone in a strange city, especially one as lovely as Emma. "We'll find another way," Margaret said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Emma finally turned, her green eyes holding a maturity that should have belonged to someone twice her age. What other way, Mama? We've tried everything. The Millers can't afford to pay for mending anymore. The Johnsons are talking about moving back east to live with family. There's nothing left here. The truth of it hung between them like a physical presence. Millbrook Valley was dying, and they were dying with it. Margaret had watched neighbours pack their possessions into wagons and drive away, leaving behind empty houses that would soon collapse under the weight of neglect. The general store had closed last month. The school had let its teacher go. Even the church struggled to keep its doors open with so few families left to fill the pews. A knock at the door interrupted Margaret's thoughts. She exchanged glances with Emma, both of them knowing that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news these days. Margaret smoothed her worn skirt and opened the door to find Samuel Hartwell standing on her small porch, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the poverty surrounding him. Hartwell was a merchant who had arrived in town 6 months ago, ostensibly to buy property from families desperate to sell. He was a man in his 50s with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw, assigning value and calculating profit. His presence always made Margaret's skin crawl, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, removing his hat with practiced courtesy, "I hope I'm not disturbing your evening." "Mr. Hartwell," Margaret replied, not inviting him inside. "What brings you by?" His smile was as cold as January frost. "I've heard about your unfortunate circumstances, the foreclosure notice, the difficulties you've been experiencing. I wanted to offer my assistance." Margaret's grip tightened on the doorframe. "What kind of assistance?" "I'm traveling to San Francisco next month. There are opportunities there for young women willing to work hard. Good opportunities. I could provide transportation, lodging, even advance payment to help settle your debts here." Emma appeared at Margaret's shoulder, and Margaret felt her daughter's presence like a protective shield. Hartwell's eyes shifted to Emma, and something in his expression made Margaret's stomach turn. It was the way a man looked at livestock. He was considering purchasing. "That's very kind of you," Margaret said carefully, "but we haven't decided what we're going to do yet." Of course, Hartwell said, his tone understanding but his eyes calculating. "But opportunities like this don't come along often. I'll be making my arrangements within the week. If you're interested, I could offer, say, $200, enough to satisfy your debts and provide a fresh start." $200. It was more money than Margaret had seen in one place since Thomas's death. It would pay off the mortgage, cover their outstanding debts, and leave enough for Margaret to start over somewhere else. But the price, sending Emma away with this man to an uncertain fate in a distant city, felt like selling her soul. "I'll need time to think about it," Margaret said. "Naturally," Hartwell replied, replacing his hat, "but don't take too long. I have other families to consider, and positions in San Francisco are limited." He tipped his hat to Emma, his gaze lingering a moment too long on her face, then turned and walked away. Margaret watched until he disappeared around the bend in the road, then closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. "Mama," Emma said quietly, "what kind of work do you think he's talking about?" Margaret met her daughter's eyes and saw the same unease she felt reflected there. Emma was innocent, but she wasn't naive. She understood the implications of Hartwell's offer just as clearly as Margaret did. "I don't know," Margaret lied. "But we're not going to find out." That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Emma's steady breathing from the small bed they shared. The autumn wind rattled the loose shingles on the roof, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. She could write to her sister in Ohio, but Caroline had her own family to worry about, and barely enough to get by. She could try to find work in one of the larger towns, but what could she do? She had no education beyond what the frontier had taught her, no skills beyond keeping house and raising a daughter. And even if she found work, it would take months to earn enough to pay their debts, and they didn't have months. The letter from the bank crinkled as she rolled over, and Margaret felt the weight of her circumstances pressing down on her like a physical force. She thought about Thomas, about the promises they'd made to each other and to Emma. She thought about the life they'd planned, the future they'd imagined for their daughter. Education, marriage to a good man, children of her own, a life of dignity and purpose. None of that was possible now. The world had changed, and they had to change with it or be crushed beneath the weight of circumstances beyond their control. 3 days later, Margaret stood in the office of Judge Harrison, the man who served as both magistrate and unofficial leader of what remained of Millbrook Valley's community. The office was sparse, furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a shelf lined with legal books that had seen better days. Judge Harrison was a man in his 60s, with white hair and kind eyes that had witnessed too much hardship in recent years. "Margaret," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "what can I do for you?" She remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I need to know about the laws regarding contracts, employment contracts." Judge Harrison's expression grew cautious. "What kind of employment are we talking about?" Margaret forced herself to speak the words. "Samuel Hartwell has offered to take Emma to San Francisco. He says there are opportunities there for young women. Good opportunities." The judge's face darkened. "Margaret, you need to be very careful. I've heard things about Hartwell, rumors from other towns he's visited. The kind of opportunities he offers aren't the kind you'd want for Emma." "But what if they were?" Margaret asked desperately. "What if he's legitimate? What if this is our only chance?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with the compassion of a man who understood desperation. Even if his intentions were honorable, which I doubt, sending a 17-year-old girl away with a stranger to a city where she knows no one is dangerous. There are other ways, Margaret. We can write to charitable organizations, reach out to churches in other towns. "There's no time," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "The bank wants us out in 3 weeks. I've tried everything else. I've begged, borrowed, and sold everything we own. There's nothing left." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of impossible choices. Finally, Judge Harrison spoke. "If you're truly considering this, at least let me look into Hartwell's background. Give me a few days to send some telegrams, make some inquiries." Margaret nodded, though she wondered if a few days would make any difference. Time was running out, and desperation was making decisions that rational thought couldn't bear to consider. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Margaret noticed a figure sitting on the porch of the sheriff's office. Daniel Morrison was 25 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair and thoughtful brown eyes. He'd grown up in Millbrook Valley, the son of Sheriff Robert Morrison, and had recently returned from back east where he'd studied law at university. The mine closure had interrupted his plans to establish a practice, but he'd stayed to help his father maintain what little law and order remained in the dying town. Daniel looked up as Margaret passed, and their eyes met briefly. She saw concern in his expression, the kind of worry that came from being part of a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. He'd probably heard about Hartwell's visits, about the foreclosure notice, about the impossible situation Margaret faced. "Evening, Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly. "Evening, Daniel," she replied, not trusting herself to say more. She continued walking, but she could feel his gaze following her until she turned the corner toward home. Daniel Morrison was a good man, the kind of person Thomas would have respected. He'd grown up alongside Emma, though he was 8 years older and had left for university when she was still a child. Margaret remembered him as a serious boy who helped his father with official duties and spent his free time reading law books borrowed from Judge Harrison's collection. When Margaret reached her cabin, she found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, mending a tear in her only good dress by lamplight. The sight of her daughter's bent head, the careful attention she paid to making perfect, nearly invisible stitches, filled Margaret with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "Emma," she said, softly. Her daughter looked up and Margaret saw the question in her eyes. Emma had been waiting for this conversation, understanding that Hartwell's offer had changed everything. Margaret sat down across from her daughter, reaching across the table to cover Emma's hands with her own. "I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever decisions have to be made, I love you more than my own life. Everything I do to protect you." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "I know, Mama, and I love you too. We'll face whatever comes together." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew that wasn't true. The choice she was being forced to make would separate them, possibly forever. And the worst part was that she was beginning to understand there might be no other option. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like smoke from a dying fire, obscuring the mountains beyond and giving Millbrook Valley an otherworldly appearance. Daniel Morrison stepped out of the sheriff's office, adjusting his leather satchel as he prepared for his daily rounds. The town felt smaller each day, with more windows boarded up and fewer people walking the streets. What had once been a bustling community of nearly 300 souls now housed fewer than 60, and that number continued to dwindle. Daniel's boots echoed against the wooden sidewalk as he made his way toward the telegraph office. His father had asked him to send inquiries about Samuel Hartwell to law enforcement contacts in neighboring counties. Something about the merchant sat wrong with Sheriff Morrison, an instinct honed by 25 years of keeping the peace in frontier towns. The telegraph operator, elderly Pete Sullivan, looked up from his equipment with eyes that had grown dim from years of reading Morse code. "Morning, Daniel. What can I do for you?" "Need to send some messages about Samuel Hartwell. Man's been making offers to families in financial trouble. Want to know if other towns have had dealings with him?" Pete's weathered fingers moved across the telegraph key with practiced efficiency, sending Daniel's questions into the network of wires that connected isolated communities across the territory. Within hours, responses began filtering back, each one painting a darker picture of the man who had positioned himself as Millbrook Valley's salvation. Meanwhile, across town, Emma Whitmore walked the familiar path to the abandoned schoolhouse where she often went to think. The building had been closed since Miss Patterson left for Denver, but the door remained unlocked, and Emma found solace in the empty classroom where she had once imagined a future filled with books and learning. She settled into her old desk, running her fingers along the carved initials and hearts that previous students had etched into the wood. Her own initials were there, paired with those of Jacob Coleman, a boy who had moved away 2 years ago when his family lost their farm. Young love felt foolish now, a luxury she could no longer afford. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. Samuel Hartwell appeared in the doorway, his expensive coat and polished boots incongruous in the shabby classroom. His presence filled the small space with an uncomfortable energy that made Emma's skin crawl. "Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I was hoping to find you here." Emma stood slowly, positioning herself near the back door. "Mr. Hartwell, I don't think my mother would approve of us meeting alone." His smile was predatory, all teeth and no warmth. "Your mother is a practical woman. She understands that desperate times require bold decisions. I wanted to speak with you directly about the opportunities I mentioned." "What kind of opportunities?" Emma asked, though every instinct told her she didn't want to know the answer. Hartwell moved closer, and Emma caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, something that reminded her of the way meat smelled when it had been left too long in the heat. San Francisco is a growing city full of wealthy men who appreciate refinement and beauty. A young woman with your attributes could do very well for herself. The way he said attributes made Emma's stomach turn. She understood now what her mother had been trying to protect her from understanding. The work Hartwell offered wasn't serving meals or cleaning rooms. It was something far darker, something that would steal not just her innocence, but her soul. "I should go," Emma said, moving toward the door. Hartwell's hand shot out, grasping her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't be hasty, my dear. Your mother owes significant money. The bank will take everything within weeks. This arrangement could solve all your family's problems." Emma tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Let me go. I'm offering you a chance at a better life than anything this dying town could provide. Fine clothes, comfortable lodgings, the companionship of successful men. Many girls would be grateful for such an opportunity." "I said, let me go." Emma wrenched her arm free and backed toward the door. Hartwell's facade of gentility slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Think carefully about refusing my offer. Your mother may not have the luxury of choice much longer." Emma fled the schoolhouse, her heart pounding as she ran through the morning mist toward home. She didn't see Daniel Morrison emerging from behind the building where he had been investigating reports of vandalism, his jaw clenched with fury at what he had witnessed. Back at the telegraph office, Pete Sullivan waved Daniel over with urgent gestures. A stack of responses had accumulated, each one more damning than the last. Hartwell had visited at least 6 other towns in the past 2 years, always targeting families in desperate circumstances. In Copper Falls, 3 young women had disappeared after accepting his offers of employment. In Silver Creek, a father who had questioned Hartwell's intentions had been found beaten unconscious behind the saloon. In each case, local authorities had been powerless to act because the contracts Hartwell used were technically legal, and the women had signed them willingly. "There's more," Pete said grimly. "Got a response from a detective in Denver. Hartwell is connected to a network that supplies girls to brothels in California mining camps. Pays well because the girls are young and new to the business." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. The scope of Hartwell's operation was larger and more vicious than anyone had imagined. He wasn't just a predator. He was part of an organized system that traded in human misery. "Send another message," Daniel said. "Ask about auction houses and private sales. I need to know exactly how this works." As Pete's fingers flew across the telegraph key, Daniel's mind raced through legal possibilities. Hartwell was careful to operate within the bounds of territorial law, using contracts and documentation that made his activities appear legitimate. But there had to be a way to stop him, some legal precedent or loophole that could be exploited. The response from Denver arrived within an hour, and its contents made Daniel's blood run cold. Hartwell didn't just recruit girls for brothels, he sold them at private auctions to the highest bidder. The girls signed contracts believing they were agreeing to legitimate employment, but the fine print transferred ownership of their labor to Hartwell for a period of 7 years. Once in California, they discovered the true nature of their situation, but by then they were trapped by debt, isolation, and the threat of violence. Daniel grabbed his hat and headed for the door. Margaret Whitmore needed to know what kind of man she was, considering trusting with her daughter's life. He found Margaret hanging laundry behind her cabin, her movements mechanical and joyless. The clothes on the line were patched and faded, but clean and carefully mended. She looked up as he approached, and he saw the weight of her circumstances etched in the lines around her eyes. "Daniel," she said, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What brings you by?" "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to talk to you about Samuel Hartwell." Margaret's hand stilled on the clothespin she had been holding. What about him? Daniel pulled the telegraph messages from his pocket. I've been making inquiries. Hartwell isn't what he claims to be. He's a trafficker, Mrs. Whitmore. The work he offers Emma isn't legitimate employment. Margaret sank onto the wooden stump she used as a seat, the clothespin falling from nerveless fingers. What are you saying? I'm saying he sells girls to brothels and private buyers. The contracts he uses look legal, but they're designed to trap women in situations they can't escape. Emma wouldn't be working in a hotel or restaurant. She'd be— Stop, Margaret whispered, her face draining of color. Please stop. Daniel knelt beside her, his voice gentle but urgent. I know you're desperate. I know the situation seems impossible, but there has to be another way. Margaret's laugh was bitter and broken. Another way? I've explored every possibility. There is no other way. What if there was? Daniel asked. What if someone could pay off your debts, give you enough to start over somewhere else? Who? Margaret demanded. Who in this dying town has that kind of money? Judge Harrison is barely keeping his own practice afloat. The merchants are all bankrupt. Even your father hasn't been paid his salary in 3 months. Daniel stood slowly, an idea forming in his mind. It was risky, possibly foolish, but it might be their only chance. I have some money saved from my time back east. Not much, but maybe enough. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. Why would you do that? Emma is nothing to you. She's not nothing, Daniel said quietly. She's a member of this community. She's someone worth protecting, and— He paused, searching for the right words. I've watched her grow up from a distance. I've seen her kindness, her strength, her intelligence. The world would be a darker place without people like Emma in it. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I couldn't take your money. It wouldn't be right. It would be a loan, Daniel said. You could pay me back when you're able, and Emma would be safe. Before Margaret could respond, Emma herself appeared around the corner of the cabin. Her face flushed from running. She looked between her mother and Daniel with confusion and growing alarm. What's wrong? She asked. I saw you talking and— Emma, Margaret said, standing and reaching for her daughter. Daniel has some information about Mr. Hartwell. Daniel explained what he had learned, watching Emma's face grow pale as the full horror of Hartwell's operation became clear. When he finished, she stood silent for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He found me at the schoolhouse this morning, she said finally. He made it clear what kind of work he was offering. I tried to leave, but he grabbed my arm, said Mother might not have a choice much longer. Daniel's jaw tightened. He threatened you? Not directly, but the implication was clear enough. Margaret pulled Emma close, her protective instincts flaring. We're not considering his offer anymore. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. But the bank, Emma protested. The foreclosure, where will we go? I don't know, Margaret admitted, but I won't sell you to that monster. I'd rather live under a bridge than see you in his hands. Daniel cleared his throat. I've made your mother an offer. I have money saved that could cover your debts and give you a fresh start somewhere else. Emma looked at him with surprise and suspicion. Why would you do that for us? The question hung in the air between them. Daniel found himself studying Emma's face, noting the way the afternoon light caught the gold threads in her auburn hair, the determination in her green eyes, the stubborn tilt of her chin that reminded him of her mother. She had grown from the quiet girl he remembered into a young woman of remarkable strength and beauty, because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. But even as he spoke the words, Daniel knew they weren't the complete truth. Something deeper was driving his desire to protect Emma, something he wasn't ready to examine too closely. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Daniel sat in his father's office reviewing. The legal documents he had drawn up. Sheriff Morrison watched his son work, noting the careful attention Daniel paid to every clause and provision. "You sure about this, son?" the older man asked. "That's most of your savings." "I'm sure," Daniel replied without looking up from his writing. "This wouldn't have anything to do with the fact that Emma Whitmore has grown into a beautiful young woman, would it?" Daniel's pen paused in its movement across the paper. "This is about stopping Hartwell and protecting an innocent family." "I'm not saying you're wrong," Sheriff Morrison said carefully, "but I want you to be honest with yourself about your motivations. Emma's been through enough without having to navigate the complications of a man's romantic feelings." Daniel set down his pen and met his father's eyes. "I know what I'm doing." "Do you? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're preparing to turn your life upside down for a girl you've barely spoken to in years." The truth of his father's words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He had been telling himself that his actions were purely altruistic, motivated by duty and compassion. But watching Emma in the schoolyard with Hartwell, seeing the fear in her eyes and the vulnerability beneath her brave facade, had awakened something in him that went far beyond civic responsibility. "Maybe," Daniel admitted quietly, "but that doesn't change what needs to be done. Hartwell has to be stopped, and the Whitmores need help. My motivations don't alter those facts." Sheriff Morrison nodded slowly. "Just be careful, son. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and the road to heartbreak is paved with grand gestures." As Daniel finished preparing the loan documents, he wondered if his father was right. Was he about to make a terrible mistake? Was he letting his feelings for Emma cloud his judgment? But then he thought about the alternative. Emma disappearing into Hartwell's network, lost forever to a world of exploitation and abuse. Whatever his motivations, whatever the consequences for his own heart, he couldn't allow that to happen. Tomorrow, he would present his offer to the Whitmores. Tomorrow, he would find out if his money could buy Emma's freedom, or if Hartwell's web was already too tightly woven to escape. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Millbrook Valley like a burial shroud, broken only by the amber glow from kerosene lamps flickering in scattered windows. Daniel Morrison had been awake since 3 in the morning, pacing the confines of his small room above the sheriff's office, his mind churning through the events that would unfold with the rising sun. Today was the day Hartwell had scheduled his departure, and Margaret Whitmore's deadline with the bank loomed just 48 hours away. Daniel had prepared his loan offer with meticulous care, consulting every legal text in Judge Harrison's library to ensure the documents would stand up to scrutiny. But as the hours passed, a growing sense of unease settled in his chest like a cold stone. Sheriff Morrison emerged from his bedroom, fully dressed despite the early hour. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, noting his son's haggard appearance. "Something's wrong," Daniel said, pausing by the window that overlooked Main Street. "Hartwell's too confident, too relaxed for a man whose plans might be disrupted. He acts like he's already won." The older man joined his son at the window, his experienced eyes scanning the empty street below. "Men like Hartwell don't survive by leaving things to chance. He'll have contingency plans." As if summoned by their conversation, a figure emerged from the shadows across the street. Samuel Hartwell walked with purpose toward the hotel, his expensive coat billowing behind him in the morning wind. Even from a distance, there was something predatory about his movement, like a wolf circling prey. "I'm going to present my offer to the Whitmores this morning," Daniel said. "Before Hartwell can pressure them into signing anything." Sheriff Morrison placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Be careful. Desperate people sometimes make desperate choices, even when better options are available." Daniel gathered his documents and headed into the grey morning, his boots crunching on frost-covered ground. The walk to the Whitmore cabin felt longer than usual. Each step weighted with the knowledge that lives hung in the balance. As he approached the small dwelling, he could see smoke rising from the chimney and candlelight flickering in the windows. Margaret answered his knock immediately, as if she had been waiting by the door. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had spent the night wrestling with impossible decisions. "Daniel," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "You're early." Emma sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of what appeared to be weak tea. She looked up as Daniel entered, and he was struck by the composure in her expression. Despite everything she faced, there was no self-pity in her green eyes, only a quiet determination that spoke to the strength of her character. "I've prepared the loan documents," Daniel said, pulling the papers from his satchel. "The amount would be sufficient to pay off your mortgage and provide enough for you to relocate and start fresh elsewhere." Margaret took the documents with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the carefully written terms. This is incredibly generous, Daniel, but I don't understand why you'd risk your own future for us." Before Daniel could answer, Emma spoke up. "Because he's a good man. Mama, the kind of man Papa would have respected." The simple honesty of her words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He found himself looking into Emma's eyes, seeing not the child he remembered, but a woman of remarkable insight and grace. In that moment, he understood that his feelings for her went far beyond protective instinct or childhood memory. "The terms are reasonable," he said, forcing himself to focus on the practical matters. "Low interest, flexible payment schedule. You could take as long as you need to repay." Margaret set the papers on the table, her expression conflicted. "It would solve our immediate problems, but it would also make us indebted to you for years to come. That's not fair to you, Daniel." "What's not fair is what Hartwell is trying to do," Daniel replied firmly. "This is a legitimate business arrangement between neighbors, nothing more." But even as he spoke the words, Daniel knew they weren't entirely true. His offer was motivated by more than neighborly concern, and the careful way Emma watched him suggested she understood that as well. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Margaret's face went pale, and Emma unconsciously moved closer to her mother. Daniel positioned himself between the women and the door, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. Margaret opened the door to reveal Samuel Hartwell, flanked by two men Daniel didn't recognize. Both were large, rough-looking individuals. With the bearing of hired muscle, Hartwell's smile was cold and predatory as he surveyed the scene before him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said smoothly, "I trust you've had time to consider my offer. I'll be departing within the hour, and I need your decision now." "She's considering other options," Daniel said, stepping forward. Hartwell's eyes fixed on Daniel with barely concealed malice. "Ah, young Morrison, I wondered when you might insert yourself into this situation." He gestured toward the documents on the table. "Playing the white knight, are we? How romantic." "It's a business proposition," Daniel said evenly. "Of course, it is." Hartwell laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Tell me, Mrs. Whitmore, has our noble sheriff's son explained the reality of his generous offer? The years of debt, the interest payments, the obligation that would bind you to him indefinitely?" Margaret's eyes darted between the two men, uncertainty clouding her features. Daniel said the terms were fair. "Fair?" Hartwell's voice dripped with false sympathy. "My dear woman, you would be trading one form of bondage for another. At least, my offer provides immediate resolution and genuine opportunity for your daughter." Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Your offer is an insult and a lie. We know what kind of opportunities you provide." Hartwell's facade slipped for a moment, revealing the predator beneath. "Careful, child. You're in no position to make accusations." "Neither are you." Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority of his legal training. "I've documented your activities in other towns. The territorial marshal is aware of your operation." The two men flanking Hartwell shifted position, their hands moving to weapons concealed beneath their coats. The small cabin suddenly felt charged with violent possibility. "Documentation means nothing without proof," Hartwell said calmly. "And proof is difficult to obtain when witnesses have a tendency to relocate." The threat was clear, and Daniel felt his blood run cold. Hartwell wasn't just a trafficker. He was willing to use violence to protect his operation. However, Hartwell continued, his tone becoming businesslike. "I'm prepared to make this simple for everyone involved. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm increasing my offer to $300. Final payment, no obligations, no debt. Your daughter comes with me willingly, and you have enough money to start over anywhere you choose." Margaret gasped at the amount. $300 was more money than she had ever seen in one place, enough to pay off every debt and provide a comfortable life for years to come. "And if we refuse?" Emma asked. Though Daniel could see she already knew the answer, Hartwell's smile was razor-sharp. "Then you'll face the consequences of your choices. Foreclosure, destitution, and the kind of desperation that leads to far worse situations than the comfortable life I'm offering." Daniel watched Margaret's face as she processed Hartwell's words. He could see the war being fought behind her eyes, maternal love battling against crushing necessity, hope struggling against despair. "Mama." "No," Emma whispered, recognizing the direction of her mother's thoughts. "I need to think," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "There's no time for thinking," Hartwell replied. "My associates and I will return in 1 hour for your final decision. Choose wisely, Mrs. Whitmore. This opportunity won't come again." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Mr. Morrison, I'd advise against any heroic gestures. My friends here are quite skilled at discouraging interference." After Hartwell and his men departed, the cabin fell into heavy silence. Margaret sank into her chair, her head in her hands, while Emma stared out the window with unseeing eyes. Daniel remained standing, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. $300, Margaret whispered. "It's enough to pay everything and still have money left over." "It's blood money, Mama," Emma said firmly. "I won't be sold like livestock, no matter how much he offers." "But what choice do we have?" Margaret's voice cracked with despair. "Daniel's loan would help, but it would take years to repay. We'd be starting over with nothing but debt. At least Hartwell's offer would give me the means to build a new life." "What kind of life would it be, knowing what you sacrificed for it?" Emma knelt beside her mother's chair. "I'd rather face poverty with my dignity intact than live comfortably knowing I was purchased." Daniel cleared his throat. There might be another option. Both women looked at him expectantly. What if we could expose Hartwell's operation publicly? Force him to leave town empty-handed? "How?" Margaret asked. "You said to yourself that his contracts appear legal." "Legal in form, perhaps, but not in intent. If we could get him to reveal his true purposes in front of witnesses." Emma's eyes lit up with understanding. "You want to set a trap." "It's dangerous," Daniel admitted. "But it might be our only chance to stop him permanently." Margaret shook her head. "I can't ask you to risk your life for us." "You're not asking," Daniel replied. "I'm volunteering." He moved to the window, checking the street for signs of Hartwell's return. "Here's what I propose. We agree to his offer, but we insist on a public ceremony. Make it seem like you want the transaction to appear legitimate, respectable. If we can get him to reveal his true intentions in front of Judge Harrison and other witnesses." "He's too smart for that," Emma said. "He'll never expose himself willingly." "Maybe not willingly," Daniel agreed. "But men like Hartwell have one weakness, their arrogance. If we can make him angry enough, overconfident enough, he might say more than he intends. Margaret looked between her daughter and Daniel, seeing the determination in both their faces. And if this plan fails, if Hartwell sees through the deception, then we'll face whatever comes, Emma said firmly. But at least we'll have tried to fight back. Daniel checked his pocket watch. We have 40 minutes to prepare. I need to arrange for witnesses and make sure Judge Harrison understands his role. As he prepared to leave, Emma caught his arm. Daniel, why are you doing this? Really? He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then met her eyes. Because some things are worth fighting for, even if the odds are against you. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of preparation. Daniel raced through town, gathering every respectable citizen he could find and explaining the situation in hurried whispers. Judge Harrison agreed to oversee what would appear to be a legitimate contract signing, while secretly documenting any evidence of Hartwell's criminal intent. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, Dr. Blackwood, and several other community leaders assembled in the town hall, ostensibly to witness what Margaret would present as her daughter's entrance into respectable employment. Daniel positioned himself near the back of the room, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid immediately arousing Hartwell's suspicion. When Hartwell arrived with his two companions, he surveyed the assembled crowd with obvious displeasure. Mrs. Whitmore, this wasn't part of our arrangement. Margaret stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I wanted this to be done properly, with witnesses. If Emma is to begin a new life, I want everyone to know it's a respectable opportunity. Hartwell's eyes narrowed as he studied the faces around the room. Daniel could see him calculating, weighing the risks and benefits of proceeding with the public ceremony. Very well, Hartwell said finally. But let's conclude this quickly. I have a schedule to maintain. Judge Harrison stepped forward with the contract documents. Before we proceed, I'd like to review the terms of employment to ensure everything is in order. That won't be necessary, Hartwell said sharply. The terms are quite standard. Nevertheless, the judge persisted. As a magistrate, I have a responsibility to ensure no laws are being violated. Hartwell's composure began to crack. What exactly are you implying? Nothing at all, Judge Harrison replied smoothly. Simply doing my due diligence. Now these employment contracts, they specify that Miss Whitmore will be working in San Francisco hotels and restaurants? Among other establishments, Hartwell said evasively. What other establishments? Emma asked innocently. Hartwell's jaw tightened. Private clubs, entertainment venues, places where refined young ladies are appreciated by discerning gentlemen. The euphemism hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Daniel could see several of the witnesses exchanging worried glances as the true nature of Hartwell's offer became clear. Entertainment venues? Judge Harrison pressed. Could you be more specific? That's enough questions, Hartwell snapped. Mrs. Whitmore has agreed to my terms. The money has been offered and the contract is ready for signing. But surely, Dr. Blackwood interjected, a respectable employment opportunity wouldn't require such secrecy about the specifics. Hartwell whirled to face the doctor, his carefully maintained facade finally crumbling. Respectable? This isn't about respectability. It's about survival. These people are desperate, and I'm offering them a way out. What happens after that is none of your concern. So you admit, Judge Harrison said quietly, that respectability isn't a factor in this arrangement? The trap had been sprung. Hartwell realized too late that his anger had led him to reveal more than he intended. The assembled witnesses had heard enough to understand the true nature of his proposal. This meeting is over, Hartwell declared, reaching for the contracts. But Daniel was already moving, stepping between Hartwell and the door. I don't think so. Judge Harrison, I believe we have sufficient evidence to detain Mr. Hartwell for questioning. Hartwell's two companions reached for their weapons, But Sheriff Morrison appeared in the doorway behind them, his gun already drawn. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, gentlemen." The room erupted into chaos as Hartwell realized his carefully laid plans were unraveling. But the most dangerous moments were yet to come, and Daniel knew that a cornered predator was often at his most vicious. The tension in the town hall stretched taut as a bowstring ready to snap. Sheriff Morrison kept his weapon trained on Hartwell's men, while the assembled witnesses pressed back against the walls, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and fascination. Emma stood frozen beside her mother, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the careful plan Daniel had orchestrated begin to crumble into chaos. Hartwell's eyes darted between the sheriff's gun and the crowd of witnesses, his mind clearly calculating his remaining options. The civilized mask he had worn for weeks had finally slipped away completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold menace of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You've made a grave mistake, Morrison," Hartwell said, his tone deadly calm. "Do you really think exposing me here will end this? I'm part of something much larger than your small-town understanding can grasp." Judge Harrison stepped forward, his legal mind already working through the implications. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm prepared to offer you safe passage out of town if you leave immediately and never return. No charges will be filed if you go quietly." Hartwell laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "How generous! But I'm afraid I can't accept such a gracious offer. You see, I've already made commitments regarding Miss Whitmore, commitments that carry significant financial penalties if not fulfilled." Daniel felt ice form in his veins. "What kind of commitments?" "The kind that require delivery of specific merchandise to specific buyers," Hartwell replied, his gaze fixed on Emma with predatory intensity. "Wealthy men in San Francisco who have paid handsomely for the privilege of evaluating new arrivals." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "You mean she's already been sold?" "Pre-sold, you might say, a common practice in our industry to ensure quality control and customer satisfaction." The casual way Hartwell spoke about human trafficking as a business transaction sent ripples of revulsion through the assembled crowd. Several of the witnesses began murmuring among themselves, their voices building toward outrage. Sheriff Morrison's grip tightened on his weapon. "That's enough. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit—" "Wait!" Hartwell interrupted, raising his hand. "Before you make any hasty decisions, Sheriff, perhaps you should understand the full scope of what you're interfering with." He reached slowly into his coat pocket, extracting a leather portfolio. "I have documentation here that might interest you. Bills of sale, transport arrangements, and most importantly, a signed contract from Mrs. Whitmore herself." Margaret's face went white. "I never signed anything." Hartwell's smile was razor-thin. "Didn't you? Let me refresh your memory." He opened the portfolio and withdrew a document. 3 days ago, you visited my hotel room to discuss the arrangement. You signed a preliminary agreement stating your intention to transfer custody of your daughter in exchange for financial consideration." "That's impossible," Daniel said. But even as he spoke, he saw doubt creeping into Margaret's expression. I did visit him," Margaret whispered. "He said he needed some kind of acknowledgement that I was seriously considering his offer. But it was just a formality, a way to show good faith." Hartwell's triumphant expression made Daniel's stomach turn. The man had been planning this trap for days, possibly weeks. Every move had been calculated to ensnare the Whitmores in a web of legal technicalities that would be difficult to escape. "The document you signed," Hartwell continued, "constitutes a binding preliminary contract under territorial law. My buyers have paid substantial deposits based on that commitment. Breaking the agreement would expose you to significant financial liability." Judge Harrison held out his hand. "Let me see that document." Hartwell hesitated, then passed the paper to the judge. Harrison studied it carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. "I'm afraid he's correct," the judge said quietly. "This document, while deceptively worded, does constitute a legal commitment. Mrs. Whitmore has agreed to transfer custody of her daughter in exchange for monetary consideration." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She swayed on her feet, and Emma moved quickly to steady her mother. "But surely," Dr. Blackwood protested, "such a contract would be invalid. If it involves illegal activity, proving illegal intent would require evidence of criminal conspiracy," Judge Harrison replied. "As written, this could be interpreted as a legitimate employment contract with parental consent." Daniel's mind raced through every legal principle he had studied, searching for a loophole or precedent that could invalidate Hartwell's trap. But the man had been careful, using language that appeared legitimate while concealing his true purpose. "However," Hartwell said, his confidence returning, "I'm not an unreasonable man. I understand that circumstances have changed since our original agreement. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm prepared to offer you a choice." Margaret looked up with desperate hope. "What choice?" "I could release you from your contractual obligations in exchange for appropriate compensation. Let's say $500 to cover my expenses and the penalties I'll face from my buyers." The astronomical sum hung in the air like a death sentence. $500 was more money than most families in Millbrook Valley would see in a lifetime. "That's extortion," Daniel said through gritted teeth. "That's business," Hartwell corrected. "Alternatively, we can proceed with the original arrangement. Miss Whitmore comes with me. Mrs. Whitmore receives her payment, and everyone honors their commitments." Emma had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now she stepped forward with quiet dignity. "And if I refuse to go voluntarily?" Hartwell's expression hardened. "Then I'll be forced to pursue legal remedies. Sheriff, surely you understand that I have the right to enforce a valid contract?" The awful truth of their situation began to sink in. Hartwell had maneuvered them into a position where the law itself worked in his favor. Unless someone could produce $500, Emma would be legally bound to honor her mother's commitment. "Wait," Daniel said suddenly. "If this is truly a contract dispute, then it should be resolved according to territorial law. Mrs. Whitmore has the right to seek competing offers for her daughter's services." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting an auction," Daniel said firmly. "If Mr. Hartwell insists on treating Emma like property, then property law should apply. The highest bidder wins." Hartwell's confidence wavered for the first time. "That's not how these arrangements typically work, but it is how contract law works," Judge Harrison said thoughtfully. "If Mrs. Whitmore receives a higher offer for her daughter's services, she would be legally justified in breaking her agreement with you, provided she compensates you for your documented expenses." "This is insane," Emma protested. "I'm not property to be auctioned off." "It's a legal maneuver," Daniel explained quietly. "If I can outbid Hartwell, I can set the terms of your employment myself. I can hire you as a teacher, a housekeeper, anything legitimate." Margaret's eyes lit up with understanding. "You mean—" "I mean I'll bid against Hartwell for your daughter's contract. Whatever he offers, I'll offer more." Hartwell's face flushed with anger. "You don't have that kind of money, boy." "Don't I?" Daniel's voice carried a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "I have savings, property I can mortgage, assets I can liquidate. How much are you prepared to risk on your assumption?" The challenge hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Hartwell's eyes narrowed as he calculated the odds, weighing his certain profit against the possibility of losing everything to a young lawyer with more courage than sense. "Very well," Hartwell said finally. "If you insist on turning this into a spectacle, so be it. But understand that once we begin, there's no backing down. The highest bidder wins, and the loser accepts the consequences." Judge Harrison cleared his throat. If we're going to conduct this unusual proceeding, we need to establish clear rules. This will be a legitimate auction under territorial law with binding results." The next few minutes passed in a blur of legal preparations. Judge Harrison established the terms. Sealed bids would be submitted, with the highest bidder winning Emma's employment contract. The winner would also be responsible for compensating Hartwell for his documented expenses, effectively buying out his claim. As the rules were explained, Daniel felt the weight of what he was attempting. His savings amounted to slightly over $400, money he had intended to use for establishing his law practice. But even that might not be enough if Hartwell had deeper resources than expected. Emma approached him as he prepared his bid. "Daniel, you can't risk everything for me. What if you lose?" He looked into her green eyes, seeing the fear and gratitude warring in their depths. "Then at least I'll know I tried to do the right thing. But your future, your career, my future. Doesn't matter if I have to live knowing I failed to protect you when I had the chance." The simple honesty of his words brought tears to Emma's eyes. She reached out impulsively and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I want you to know that I'll never forget what you're trying to do." Daniel felt the warmth of her touch travel up his arm and settle around his heart. In that moment, he understood that his feelings for Emma had moved far beyond childhood memories or protective instinct. He was falling in love with her, perhaps had already fallen, and the knowledge both terrified and exhilarated him. Judge Harrison called for the sealed bids to be submitted. Daniel wrote his figure on a piece of paper, $450, nearly everything he had in the world, and sealed it in an envelope. Hartwell did the same, his expression unreadable. "Before we open these bids," the judge announced, "I want to make certain that both parties understand the binding nature of this agreement. Mr. Morrison, if your bid is successful, you will be legally responsible for Miss Whitmore's employment and welfare. Mr. Hartwell, if your bid is successful, Miss Whitmore will be bound to honor the terms of your employment offer." Both men nodded their understanding. "Very well," Judge Harrison said, reaching for the envelopes. "Let's see what we have." He opened Daniel's bid first, his expression neutral as he read the amount. The casual way Hartwell spoke about human trafficking as a business transaction sent ripples of revulsion through the assembled crowd. Several of the witnesses began murmuring among themselves, their voices building toward outrage. Sheriff Morrison's grip tightened on his weapon. "That's enough. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit—" "Wait," Hartwell interrupted, raising his hand. "Before you make any hasty decisions, Sheriff, perhaps you should understand the full scope of what you're interfering with." He reached slowly into his coat pocket, extracting a leather portfolio. "I have documentation here that might interest you. Bills of sale, transport arrangements, and most importantly, a signed contract from Mrs. Whitmore herself." Margaret's face went white. "I never signed anything." Hartwell's smile was razor-thin. "Didn't you? Let me refresh your memory." He opened the portfolio and withdrew a document. 3 days ago, you visited my hotel room to discuss the arrangement. You signed a preliminary agreement stating your intention to transfer custody of your daughter in exchange for financial consideration. "That's impossible," Daniel said, but even as he spoke, he saw doubt creeping into Margaret's expression. I did visit him," Margaret whispered. "He said he needed some kind of acknowledgement that I was seriously considering his offer. But it was just a formality, a way to show good faith." Hartwell's triumphant expression made Daniel's stomach turn. The man had been planning this trap for days, possibly weeks. Every move had been calculated to ensnare the Whitmores in a web of legal technicalities that would be difficult to escape. "The document you signed," Hartwell continued, "constitutes a binding preliminary contract under territorial law. My buyers, have paid substantial deposits based on that commitment. Breaking the agreement would expose you to significant financial liability. Judge Harrison held out his hand. Let me see that document. Hartwell hesitated, then passed the paper to the judge. Harrison studied it carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. I'm afraid he's correct, the judge said quietly. This document, while deceptively worded, does constitute a legal commitment. Mrs. Whitmore has agreed to transfer custody of her daughter in exchange for monetary consideration. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She swayed on her feet, and Emma moved quickly to steady her mother. But surely, Dr. Blackwood protested, such a contract would be invalid. If it involves illegal activity, proving illegal intent would require evidence of criminal conspiracy, Judge Harrison replied. As written, this could be interpreted as a legitimate employment contract with parental consent. Daniel's mind raced through every legal principle. He had studied, searching for a loophole or precedent that could invalidate Hartwell's trap. But the man had been careful, using language that appeared legitimate while concealing his true purpose. However, Hartwell said, his confidence returning, I'm not an unreasonable man. I understand that circumstances have changed since our original agreement. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm prepared to offer you a choice. Margaret looked up with desperate hope. What choice? I could release you from your contractual obligations in exchange for appropriate compensation. Let's say $500 to cover my expenses and the penalties I'll face from my buyers. The astronomical sum hung in the air like a death sentence. $500 was more money than most families in Millbrook Valley would see in a lifetime. That's extortion, Daniel said through gritted teeth. That's business, Hartwell corrected. Alternatively, we can proceed with the original arrangement. Miss Whitmore comes with me, Mrs. Whitmore receives her payment, and everyone honors their commitments. Emma had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now she stepped forward with quiet dignity. And if I refuse to go voluntarily? Hartwell's expression hardened. Then I'll be forced to pursue legal remedies. Sheriff, surely you understand that I have the right to enforce a valid contract. The awful truth of their situation began to sink in. Hartwell had maneuvered them into a position where the law itself worked in his favor. Unless someone could produce $500, Emma would be legally bound to honor her mother's commitment. Wait, Daniel said suddenly. If this is truly a contract dispute, then it should be resolved according to territorial law. Mrs. Whitmore has the right to seek competing offers for her daughter's services. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting an auction, Daniel said firmly. If Mr. Hartwell insists on treating Emma like property, then property law should apply. The highest bidder wins. Hartwell's confidence wavered for the first time. That's not how these arrangements typically work, but it is how contract law works, Judge Harrison said thoughtfully. If Mrs. Whitmore receives a higher offer for her daughter's services, she would be legally justified in breaking her agreement with you, provided she compensates you for your documented expenses. This is insane, Emma protested. I'm not property to be auctioned off. It's a legal maneuver, Daniel explained quietly. If I can outbid Hartwell, I can set the terms of your employment myself. I can hire you as a teacher, a housekeeper, anything legitimate. Margaret's eyes lit up with understanding. I mean, I'll bid against Hartwell for your daughter's contract. Whatever he offers, I'll offer more. Hartwell's face flushed with anger. You don't have that kind of money, boy. Don't I? Daniel's voice carried a confidence he didn't entirely feel. I have savings, property I can mortgage, assets I can liquidate. How much are you prepared to risk on your assumption? The challenge hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Hartwell's eyes narrowed as he calculated the odds, weighing his certain profit against the possibility of losing everything to a young lawyer with more courage than sense. Very well, Hartwell said finally. "If you insist on turning this into a spectacle, so be it. But understand that once we begin, there's no backing down. The highest bidder wins, and the loser accepts the consequences." Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "If we're going to conduct this unusual proceeding, we need to establish clear rules. This will be a legitimate auction under territorial law with binding results." The next few minutes passed in a blur of legal preparations. Judge Harrison established the terms. Sealed bids would be submitted, with the highest bidder winning Emma's employment contract. The winner would also be responsible for compensating Hartwell for his documented expenses, effectively buying out his claim. As the rules were explained, Daniel felt the weight of what he was attempting. His savings amounted to slightly over $400, money he had intended to use for establishing his law practice, but even that might not be enough if Hartwell had deeper resources than expected. Emma approached him as he prepared his bid. "Daniel, you can't risk everything for me. What if you lose?" He looked into her green eyes, seeing the fear and gratitude warring in their depths. "Then at least I'll know I tried to do the right thing. But your future, your career, my future, doesn't matter if I have to live knowing I failed to protect you when I had the chance." The simple honesty of his words brought tears to Emma's eyes. She reached out impulsively and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I want you to know that I'll never forget what you're trying to do." Daniel felt the warmth of her touch travel up his arm and settle around his heart. In that moment, he understood that his feelings for Emma had moved far beyond childhood memories or protective instinct. He was falling in love with her, perhaps had already fallen, and the knowledge both terrified and exhilarated him. Judge Harrison called for the sealed bids to be submitted. Daniel wrote his figure on a piece of paper, $450, nearly everything he had in the world, and sealed it in an envelope. Hartwell did the same, his expression unreadable. "Before we open these bids," the judge announced, "I want to make certain that both parties understand the binding nature of this agreement. Mr. Morrison, if your bid is successful, you will be legally responsible for Miss Whitmore's employment and welfare. Mr. Hartwell, if your bid is successful, Miss Whitmore will be bound to honor the terms of your employment offer." Both men nodded their understanding. "Very well," Judge Harrison said, reaching for the envelopes. "Let's see what we have." He opened Daniel's bid first, his expression neutral as he read the amount. Then he opened Hartwell's envelope, and his eyebrows rose in surprise. "The bids are closer than I expected," he said slowly. "Mr. Morrison has bid $450. Mr. Hartwell has bid—" The pause seemed to last forever. $475. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He had lost $25, a pittance that might as well have been a fortune. Around the room, he could hear shocked gasps and murmurs of dismay. Hartwell's triumphant smile made Daniel's blood boil. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. I believe that concludes our business." "Wait," Emma said suddenly. "I want to make my own bid." Every eye in the room turned to her. Judge Harrison looked confused. "Miss Whitmore, you can't bid on your own employment contract." "Why not?" she asked, her voice gaining strength. "If I'm to be treated like property, then I should have the right to purchase my own freedom." "With what money?" Hartwell demanded. Emma reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a small cloth bag. "I have $17 in savings. It's not much, but it's mine." The gesture was both heartbreaking and defiant. $17 against hundreds. It was meaningless in financial terms, but it represented something far more valuable: the refusal to surrender without a fight. Daniel stared at Emma's determined face and felt something shift inside him. She was willing to offer everything she had, knowing it wasn't enough, simply to assert her own agency in the process. The courage of it, the dignity of it, inspired him to take one last, desperate gamble. "Judge Harrison," he said, his voice carrying. "Across the silent room, I'd like to revise my bid." "The auction is closed," Hartwell protested. "Not if I'm adding additional assets," Daniel replied. "I hereby pledge my inheritance, my future earnings, and my property holdings as collateral for a bid of $600. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Daniel was offering to mortgage his entire future for Emma's freedom. "You don't have $600, Hartwell snarled. "I can borrow against my assets." "Judge Harrison, surely a promissory note secured by real property would be acceptable." The judge looked troubled. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Morrison. Such a note would need to be witnessed and documented." "I'll witness it," Sheriff Morrison said, stepping forward. "My son's word is good for any amount he promises." One by one, other voices joined in. Dr. Blackwood, Mrs. Henderson, even some of the miners who had wandered in during the commotion, all of them vouching for Daniel's character and creditworthiness. Hartwell's face twisted with rage as he realized his careful plans were unraveling. "This is preposterous. You can't change the rules in the middle of the game." "Can't I?" Judge Harrison mused. "Mr. Morrison is offering additional security for his bid. That seems perfectly legitimate to me." The judge turned to Daniel. "Are you certain about this, son? You're pledging your entire future." Daniel looked at Emma, seeing the hope and terror warring in her expression. Then he looked at Margaret, at the crowd of neighbors who had rallied to support him, at his father's proud face. "I'm certain," he said firmly. Hartwell realized he was trapped. He could raise his own bid, but that would require revealing the true extent of his resources, money that might be difficult to explain to authorities. Alternatively, he could accept defeat and cut his losses. $650, Hartwell said through gritted teeth. The counter-bid sent a ripple of tension through the room. Daniel felt his heart sink as he realized the game might be beyond his reach after all. But then Emma stepped forward again, her chin raised with quiet determination. "Mr. Hartwell, I have a question for you." "What?" he snapped. "If you win this auction, what guarantee do I have that you'll honor your promises about comfortable lodgings and respectable work?" Hartwell's hesitation was telling. "You have my word." "The word of a man who traffics in human misery," Emma's voice carried across the room like a bell. "I think not." She turned to address the assembled crowd. "I want everyone here to understand what's really being decided. Mr. Hartwell isn't buying my services. He's buying my life. Once I leave with him, I'll disappear into a world where women, our property and dignity is a luxury few can afford." Her words struck the crowd like lightning. The murmurs grew louder, more agitated. "Daniel Morrison," Emma continued, "is offering to risk everything he has to save someone he barely knows. Not because he expects anything in return, but because it's the right thing to do." She looked directly at Hartwell. "So I'll make you a different kind of offer, Mr. Hartwell. Take your money and leave Millbrook Valley forever. Find your victims somewhere else, among people who don't have neighbors willing to fight for them." The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Hartwell looked around the room, seeing the faces of people who had gone from witnesses to adversaries. His carefully calculated business transaction had become a public trial, and he was losing. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice cold with promise. "Legal contracts can't be dissolved by pretty speeches." "Perhaps not," Judge Harrison said quietly, "but they can be voided by evidence of criminal intent, and I believe we've heard quite enough evidence today." Hartwell's face went white as he realized the trap he had walked into. His own words, spoken in anger and frustration, had provided the evidence needed to invalidate his contracts. The most dangerous moment of the entire confrontation was about to begin. The atmosphere in the town hall had shifted from tense negotiation to barely controlled hostility. Hartwell's two companions flanked him like guard dogs, their hands resting conspicuously on concealed weapons. The merchant's facade of civility had cracked beyond repair, revealing the calculating predator who had built his fortune on human suffering. "You people have no idea what you're interfering with," Hartwell said, his voice carrying a menace that made several witnesses step backward. "I represent interests that extend far beyond this miserable frontier town. Powerful men who don't appreciate having their business arrangements disrupted." Sheriff Morrison adjusted his grip on his weapon, his experienced eyes reading the volatile dynamics in the room. "Are you threatening citizens under my protection, Hartwell?" "I'm stating facts," Hartwell replied coldly. "Miss Whitmore has been promised to buyers in San Francisco, men who have paid substantial deposits and who expect delivery. Disappointing them would have consequences." Daniel felt his blood run cold at the implications. "You mean there are others involved in this operation?" Hartwell's smile was predatory. "Did you think I was working alone? The market for young women is extensive and well organized. We have suppliers in dozens of towns, transport networks, and buyers who pay premium prices for quality merchandise." The casual way he referred to human beings as merchandise sent ripples of revulsion through the crowd. Emma pressed closer to her mother, her face pale, but her spine straight with determination. "Then all the more reason to stop you here and now," Judge Harrison declared. "If you're part of a larger criminal conspiracy, the territorial authorities need to be notified immediately." Hartwell laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "You naive old fool. Do you think the territorial authorities aren't already aware of our operations? Do you think we could move freely without certain accommodations being made?" The implication hung in the air like a poison cloud. If Hartwell was telling the truth, the corruption extended beyond individual predators to include law enforcement officials who looked the other way in exchange for payment. Daniel's mind raced through the legal implications. If territorial authorities were compromised, their options for seeking justice through official channels would be severely limited. They would be fighting not just Hartwell, but an entire network of corruption, regardless of who else might be involved, Daniel said firmly. "You're in our jurisdiction now, and here the law still means something." Hartwell's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "Does it? Let me paint a clearer picture for you, young Morrison. If I leave this town empty-handed, my associates will assume I've been compromised. They'll send others to collect what's owed to them, and these replacements won't be as civilized as I've been." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "You're saying more men will come?" "Undoubtedly. Men who are less inclined toward negotiation and more comfortable with direct action." Hartwell's gaze moved deliberately to Emma. "The debt will be collected one way or another." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his authority radiating like heat from a forge. "Then they'll find themselves facing the full force of the law." "Will they?" Hartwell challenged. "One aging sheriff and his idealistic son against professional criminals with unlimited resources. How long do you think you can protect everyone in this dying town?" The awful truth of their situation began to settle over the assembled crowd. They weren't just facing one man's criminal enterprise. They were confronting an entire network that had the resources and ruthlessness to pursue its objectives regardless of local resistance. Emma suddenly stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Then we make sure you don't leave empty-handed." Every eye in the room turned to her. Daniel felt his heart stop as he realized what she was considering. "Emma, no," he said urgently. But she was already moving toward Hartwell, her movements deliberate and controlled. "You want your merchandise? You want to fulfill your obligations to your buyers? Then take me." Margaret let out a strangled cry, but Emma held up her hand to forestall any protests. "I'll go with you willingly," she continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was offering. "But I have conditions." Hartwell's predatory smile returned. You're hardly in a position to make demands. Aren't I? Emma's chin lifted with quiet defiance. You just admitted that disappointing your buyers would be dangerous for you. Dead merchandise is worthless merchandise. If you want me alive and cooperative rather than fighting you every step of the way, you'll listen to my terms. Daniel started toward her, but Sheriff Morrison caught his arm. Let her speak, the older man whispered. She may be buying us time to think. Emma's eyes met Daniel's for a moment, and he saw something there that both broke his heart and filled him with admiration. She was sacrificing herself to protect everyone else, but she wasn't surrendering without extracting whatever concessions she could. First, Emma said, turning back to Hartwell, you leave Millbrook Valley immediately and never return. You make no further contact with my mother or anyone else in this town. Agreed, Hartwell said quickly, eager to close the deal. Second, you cancel any outstanding contracts or obligations that might bring your associates here looking for payment. Hartwell hesitated. That's more complicated. There are financial commitments. Figure it out, Emma interrupted. I won't cooperate if I know my compliance is putting innocent people at risk. The steel in her voice surprised everyone, including Hartwell. This wasn't the frightened girl he had expected to intimidate into submission. This was a young woman who understood exactly what she was doing and was determined to control the terms of her own sacrifice. And third, Emma continued, I want a written guarantee that my mother will receive the agreed-upon payment regardless of what happens to me later. Margaret broke free from the crowd and rushed to her daughter's side. Emma, please. There has to be another way. There isn't, Mama, Emma said gently, taking her mother's hands. You heard what he said. If I don't go with him now, worse things will come later. At least this way you'll have the money to start over somewhere safe. Daniel couldn't remain silent any longer. Emma, you can't do this. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for what? She interrupted, her green eyes flashing with emotion. For the people I love, for the community that raised me, what else is worth sacrificing for? The simple truth of her words silenced his protests. In that moment, Daniel understood that Emma's courage wasn't born of desperation, but of love. Love for her mother, for her neighbors, for the idea that some things were worth more than personal safety. Hartwell grew impatient with the emotional exchange. Touching as this is, we need to conclude our business. Miss Whitmore, do you agree to come with me under the terms you've outlined? Emma looked around the room one last time, her gaze lingering on faces she had known since childhood. When her eyes met Daniel's, he saw a depth of feeling there that took his breath away. I agree, she said quietly. Excellent. Hartwell turned to his men. Prepare the carriage. We leave within the hour. But Daniel's legal mind was working furiously, searching for any loophole or precedent that might invalidate this new arrangement. Wait, he said suddenly. Judge Harrison, doesn't Miss Whitmore have the right to legal representation before entering into such a binding agreement? The judge looked confused. Well, yes, theoretically, but then I invoke that right on her behalf, Daniel declared. As her legal counsel, I need time to review the terms and ensure her interests are protected. Hartwell's face darkened with suspicion. This is a delaying tactic. This is proper legal procedure, Daniel shot back. You've been insisting on the validity of contracts and legal obligations. Surely you wouldn't want to proceed without ensuring all legal requirements are met? The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Hartwell couldn't reject proper legal procedure without undermining his entire argument about binding contracts and territorial law. How much time? Hartwell asked through gritted teeth. 24 hours, Daniel said. Standard period for contract review. Impossible. I have a schedule to maintain. 12 hours then, Judge Harrison interjected. Surely that's reasonable for such an important agreement. Hartwell looked between Daniel and the judge, recognizing that he was being maneuvered, but unable to refuse without appearing unreasonable. 6 hours? And if there are any attempts to interfere with our departure, there won't be, Daniel assured him. You have my word as an officer of the court. The concession bought them precious time, but Daniel knew 6 hours wouldn't be enough to find a legal solution to their dilemma. As the crowd began to disperse, he found himself alone, with Emma and Margaret. "What are you planning?" Emma asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Daniel admitted. "But 6 hours is better than 6 minutes. Maybe we can find another way." Margaret looked between them with desperate hope. "Is there really a chance?" Before Daniel could answer, Sheriff Morrison approached with grave news. "Son, I just received a telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office. They want Hartwell released immediately, no charges filed." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. "What? Why?" The message came directly from the Territorial Governor's office. Apparently Hartwell has friends in very high places. Daniel felt the walls closing in around them. If territorial authorities were ordering Hartwell's release, it confirmed the merchant's claims about corruption extending to the highest levels of government. "That settles it then," Emma said with resigned determination. "There's no point in delaying the inevitable." "No," Daniel said fiercely. "There's always another option. We just have to find it." But as evening approached, and their 6-hour deadline drew near, Daniel was forced to confront the possibility that some battles couldn't be won through legal maneuvering or moral righteousness. Sometimes justice required more direct action. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. If the law couldn't protect Emma, then he would have to step outside the law to save her. The plan that formed in his mind was dangerous, possibly foolish, but it was their only remaining chance. As darkness fell over Millbrook Valley, Daniel began gathering the allies and resources he would need for one desperate gambit to outsmart a predator who seemed to hold all the advantages. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just Daniel's courage, but his willingness to risk everything, his career, his freedom, possibly his life, for the woman he had come to love. In her small cabin, Emma sat by the window, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. She had made her peace with what tomorrow would bring, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel Morrison had one more surprise in store for Samuel Hartwell. The night was about to become very dangerous for everyone involved. Sheriff Morrison found his son in the office well past midnight, hunched over maps and documents by lamplight. "Daniel, you need to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be difficult enough without you being exhausted." "I can't sleep," Daniel replied without looking up. "There has to be something we're missing, some angle we haven't considered." The older man sat down across from his son, noting the determined set of Daniel's jaw. Sometimes the hardest thing for a lawman to accept is that the law isn't always enough. Then what is? Sheriff Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes, son, a man has to decide what matters more, following the rules or doing what's right." Daniel looked up, meeting his father's eyes. In that exchange, an understanding passed between them. The elder Morrison wasn't just offering philosophical wisdom, he was giving his blessing for whatever Daniel might be planning. "If I were to hypothetically ask for your help with something that might not be strictly legal," Daniel said carefully, "what would you say?" "I'd say that an old sheriff might have trouble sleeping tonight, might have to take a long walk around town, checking on things, might not notice if certain activities were taking place while he was distracted." Daniel felt a surge of gratitude toward his father. And if those activities involved ensuring that a dangerous criminal didn't make it out of town with his intended victim? "Well," Sheriff Morrison said thoughtfully, "accidents happen on mountain roads, especially at night, especially when someone isn't familiar with the terrain." The conversation was hypothetical, but its implications were clear. Daniel wasn't going to face Hartwell alone. As his father left to begin his patrol, Daniel spread out a map of the mountain passes leading out of Millbrook Valley. There were 3 main routes Hartwell could take, but only one that would allow him to reach the railroad station in Riverside City by the next evening. If Daniel could somehow delay or redirect Hartwell's carriage at the right moment, he might be able to create an opportunity for Emma to escape. But timing would be everything, and the margin for error was dangerously small. A soft knock at the door interrupted his planning. Emma stood in the doorway, wrapped in her mother's shawl against the night chill. "I couldn't sleep either," she said quietly. "I wanted to talk to you before tomorrow." Daniel gestured for her to sit, his heart breaking at the sight of her brave face. "Emma, I want you to know—" "Please," she interrupted. "Let me say this first. I know what you're feeling. I've seen it in your eyes, heard it in your voice, and I need you to know that I feel it too." The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither had dared to cross before. "When this is over," Emma continued, "when Hartwell is gone and the danger has passed, I want you to remember that there was something real between us, something worth fighting for." Daniel reached across the table and took her hands. "It's not over. I won't let him take you." "Daniel, I mean it, Emma. I have a plan. It's risky and I can't guarantee it will work, but I'm not giving up on you, on us." Hope flickered in her eyes, quickly tempered by realistic concern. "What kind of plan?" Daniel outlined his strategy, a complex scheme involving misdirection, carefully timed interventions, and more than a little luck. As he spoke, Emma's expression shifted from resignation to cautious optimism. "It could work," she said finally, "but if something goes wrong, if you're caught, then at least I'll know I tried everything possible to save you." Emma leaned forward and kissed him gently, a touch that conveyed everything words couldn't express. "Thank you," she whispered, "for caring enough to try." As dawn approached, the pieces of Daniel's plan began falling into place. Dr. Blackwood had borrowed a sedative from his medical supplies. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a distraction that would draw Hartwell's men away from their carriage at the crucial moment. Even Judge Harrison had found a legal technicality that might buy them additional time. The entire community was rallying to save one of their own, each person contributing what they could to a desperate gambit that might be their only chance. As the sun rose over Millbrook Valley, bringing with it the day that would determine Emma's fate, Daniel made final preparations for a confrontation that would test everything he believed about justice, courage, and love. The game was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The morning air carried an electric tension that seemed to vibrate through every corner of Millbrook Valley. Daniel stood at his office window, watching the first rays of sunlight paint the eastern mountains in shades of amber and rose. His pocket watch showed 5:30 in the morning, 30 minutes before Hartwell's deadline would expire, and Emma would be forced to honor her terrible bargain. Across town, lanterns flickered in the windows of houses where ordinary citizens had spent the night preparing for an extraordinary act of defiance. Mrs. Henderson had positioned herself at the hotel kitchen, where she would slip Dr. Blackwood's sedative into the coffee she would serve to Hartwell's men. Judge Harrison waited in his office with a stack of fabricated legal documents designed to create confusion and delay. Even old Pete Sullivan at the telegraph office had his role to play, ready to send false messages that would misdirect any reinforcements Hartwell might summon. The plan was intricate, relying on precise timing and the coordinated efforts of nearly 24 townspeople. But Daniel knew that even the most careful preparation could unravel in an instant if Hartwell suspected treachery. A gentle knock at the door broke his concentration. Emma entered quietly, dressed in her traveling clothes and carrying a small carpet bag. Her face was pale but composed, her green eyes reflecting a determination that took his breath away. "It's time," she said simply. Daniel checked his watch again. They still had 25 minutes, but he understood Emma's need to face the inevitable rather than wait for it to arrive. "Are you ready?" As ready as anyone can be for something like this. She moved to stand beside him at the window, her shoulder brushing against his. "Daniel, if your plan doesn't work—" "It will work," he said firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at his confidence like acid. "But if it doesn't," she continued, "I need you to promise me something." He turned to face her fully, seeing the vulnerability beneath her brave facade. "Anything. Promise me you won't spend your life feeling guilty about what happens to me. Promise me you'll find happiness, even if it's without me." The request was so typically selfless that Daniel felt his heart clench with emotion. Even facing her own destruction, Emma was more concerned about his future well-being than her own fate. "I can't promise that," he said quietly, "because I'm not going to let him take you." Emma smiled sadly. "You can't control everything, Daniel. Sometimes bad things happen to good people, and all we can do is face them with dignity." Before he could respond, Sheriff Morrison appeared in the doorway. "It's time to move into position," he announced. "Hartwell's men are loading their carriage." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. The moment he had been planning for was finally at hand. He gathered his coat and checked the loaded pistol hidden beneath it, praying he wouldn't need to use it, but knowing he would if necessary. The three of them walked through the quiet streets, toward the hotel where Hartwell was completing his preparations. The merchant had booked 3 rooms for his party, keeping his men close and maintaining strict security around his merchandise. But his very caution would work against him once the townspeople's plan went into motion. As they approached the hotel, Daniel could see Mrs. Henderson through the dining room window, moving efficiently between tables as she served breakfast to the few early-rising guests. 2 of Hartwell's men sat at a corner table, their attention focused on their plates rather than their surroundings. The first phase of the plan was already underway. Judge Harrison emerged from his office carrying an official-looking leather portfolio, his expression grave with manufactured urgency. He intercepted Daniel and Emma on the hotel steps, speaking loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Whitmore, I'm afraid there's been a complication. I've received word from the territorial capital regarding your case." Emma played her part perfectly, feigning surprise. "What kind of complication? It appears there are questions about the validity of certain documents. I need you both to come to my office immediately for consultation." Hartwell appeared in the hotel doorway, his expensive coat buttoned against the morning chill. His cold blue eyes took in the scene with immediate suspicion. "What's this about?" he demanded. Judge Harrison turned to him with apologetic deference. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm afraid there may be a brief delay. Some paperwork irregularities have come to light that require immediate attention." Hartwell's jaw tightened. "We had an agreement, 6 hours for legal review, and that time has expired." "Indeed, but these new developments supersede our previous arrangement. Territorial law requires—" "I don't care what territorial law requires," Hartwell interrupted, his composure beginning to crack. "Miss Whitmore is coming with me now, as agreed." The confrontation was drawing attention from passers-by. Exactly. As Daniel had hoped, the more witnesses to Hartwell's unreasonable behavior, the more justified their resistance would appear. Emma stepped forward with apparent reluctance. "Perhaps it would be better to resolve these legal issues before we depart. I wouldn't want any complications to arise later." Hartwell's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, searching for signs of deception. "Very well. But I want this resolved within the hour, or our previous agreement becomes void, and we proceed under alternative arrangements." The threat was clear. If the legal delay extended too long, Hartwell would simply take Emma by force. Daniel felt his hand drift toward his concealed weapon. "Of course," Judge Harrison said smoothly. "An hour should be more than sufficient." As they moved toward the judge's office, Daniel caught sight of Mrs. Henderson emerging from the hotel kitchen. She caught his eye briefly and nodded almost imperceptibly. The first phase had been successful. Hartwell's men were now consuming coffee laced with a sedative that would leave them drowsy and slow to react when the critical moment arrived. The judge's office quickly filled with people as word spread through town about the emergency legal consultation. Dr. Blackwood arrived with his medical bag, ostensibly to provide expert testimony about Emma's physical condition. Pete Sullivan brought urgent telegrams that required immediate attention. Even the local minister appeared, claiming concern for Emma's spiritual welfare. Hartwell grew increasingly agitated as the office filled with curious townspeople. "This is ridiculous. I demand privacy for these proceedings. Territorial law requires witnesses for certain types of contracts," Judge Harrison said, consulting a thick legal tome with exaggerated thoroughness, "particularly those involving potential violations of federal statutes." "What federal statutes?" Hartwell's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Well, the Mann Act, for one. Interstate transportation of women for immoral purposes. Very serious charges if proven." Daniel watched Hartwell's face as the implications sank in. The merchant was beginning to realize that his carefully constructed legal position was crumbling under scrutiny he hadn't anticipated. "These proceedings are taking too long," Hartwell declared. "Miss Whitmore, gather your belongings. We're leaving immediately." But Emma was ready with another delaying tactic. "Mr. Hartwell, before we go, I'd like to make a formal statement regarding my understanding of our employment arrangement for legal protection." The request was perfectly reasonable, and refusing it would make Hartwell appear suspicious. Through gritted teeth, he agreed to hear her statement. Emma's formal statement was a masterpiece of deliberately vague language and tangential details. She spoke slowly and methodically about her understanding of travel arrangements, working conditions and compensation, asking for clarification on points that had never been clearly defined. Each question required consultation of documents, discussion among the assembled witnesses, and careful notation by Judge Harrison. As the minutes ticked by, Daniel could see Hartwell's patience evaporating. The merchant kept checking his pocket watch, his movements becoming more agitated with each passing moment. His schedule was clearly more important to him than he had admitted, suggesting that missing his connection in Riverside City would create serious problems for his operation. Exactly 9 o'clock. Mrs. Henderson's signal came, a deliberately dropped tray that clattered loudly in the hotel dining room next door. The sound indicated that Hartwell's men were now sufficiently sedated to be harmless. Daniel stood up suddenly. "Judge Harrison, I've just remembered something important. There's a precedent case that might apply here. Williamson versus the Territory of Montana. I need to check the law books." Before anyone could object, he was moving toward the door. "Emma, could you assist me? Your testimony might be relevant to the legal research." Hartwell started to object, but Judge Harrison intervened. "Excellent suggestion. Precedent cases are crucial in matters like this." They left the office together, moving quickly toward the back exit that led to the alley behind the building. Daniel's heart pounded as they slipped outside, knowing they had only minutes before Hartwell realized what was happening. Sheriff Morrison waited in the alley with 2 saddled horses. "The main road's being watched," he said tersely. "You'll need to take the old mining trail through Eagle Canyon." Daniel helped Emma mount her horse, then swung up onto his own. The mining trail was dangerous, winding through narrow passes and unstable ground, but it was their only chance to reach safety before Hartwell could pursue them. "Where are we going?" Emma asked, as they urged their horses into motion. "Riverside City," Daniel replied. "There's a federal marshal there who owes my father a favor. If we can reach him before Hartwell recovers, he might be able to provide protection." They galloped through the back streets of Millbrook Valley, keeping to shadows and side roads to avoid detection. As they reached the edge of town, Daniel looked back to see Judge Harrison emerging from his office, his hands raised in apparent confusion as he addressed someone inside. The distraction wouldn't last much longer. Once Hartwell realized Emma was gone, he would come after them with everything he had. The mining trail wound upward through rocky terrain that tested their horses' endurance and their own riding skills. Emma proved to be an excellent horsewoman, keeping pace despite the treacherous footing and steep inclines. Behind them, Daniel could hear the distant sound of pursuit. Horses moving fast on the main road as Hartwell and his remaining men gave chase. "They're coming!" Emma called over the sound of hoofbeats. Daniel urged his horse faster, knowing they were racing not just against Hartwell, but against time itself. The mining trail would eventually intersect with the main road at Devil's Bridge, a narrow span across Eagle Canyon. If they could cross the bridge and destroy it behind them, they might buy enough time to reach Riverside City safely. But as they approached the bridge, Daniel's heart sank. 3 riders waited on the far side, more of Hartwell's men who had taken the main road and reached the intersection first. They were trapped between pursuing enemies and blocking forces with nowhere to run. Emma pulled her horse to a stop beside his. "What do we do now?" Daniel drew his pistol, checking the cylinder to ensure it was fully loaded. "We fight." The words hung in the air between them as the sound of pursuit grew louder behind them. In moments, they would be caught between 2 groups of armed men, with only their courage and determination to protect them. Emma reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a small revolver that Daniel hadn't known she possessed. "Papa taught me to shoot when I was 12, she said calmly. "I'm better than you might expect." Despite their desperate situation, Daniel found himself smiling. Emma Whitmore continued to surprise him, revealing depths of strength and capability that made him love her even more. "Then let's show these bastards what Millbrook Valley is made of," he said. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Daniel knew that everything they had fought for, Emma's freedom, their love, their future, together would be decided in the next few minutes. Behind them, Hartwell's pursuing riders emerged from the tree line. Ahead of them, the blocking force began moving toward the bridge. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of options. But they weren't giving up without a fight. Daniel spurred his horse forward, charging toward the bridge with Emma beside him. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The sound of gunfire echoed through Eagle Canyon as the battle for Emma's freedom reached its violent climax. In the distance, a plume of smoke rose from what appeared to be Hartwell's carriage. Mrs. Henderson's final surprise, designed to eliminate the merchant's transportation and strand him in Millbrook Valley long enough for federal authorities to arrive. But first, Daniel and Emma had to survive the gauntlet of armed men who stood between them and safety. With the canyon walls rising on either side and the narrow bridge ahead, there was nowhere to run and no room for retreat. The only way out was through. Daniel's horse reared as bullets whined overhead, the animal's instincts screaming danger even as Daniel fought to control their forward momentum. Beside him, Emma's mare stumbled on loose rock, nearly throwing her from the saddle before regaining its footing. The 3 men blocking the bridge had spread out to create a crossfire, their rifles glinting in the morning sunlight. "Stay low," Daniel shouted, leaning forward against his horse's neck as another volley of shots rang out. One bullet splintered the wooden rail of the bridge just inches from where they would have to pass. Behind them, the thunder of pursuing hooves grew louder. Hartwell's voice carried over the chaos, shouting orders to his men in language that would have made a sailor blush. The merchant was no longer concerned with maintaining his civilized facade. This had become a matter of survival for his entire operation. Emma's revolver barked once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Her marksmanship proved better than advertised, as one of the blocking riders cried out and slumped in his saddle, his rifle clattering to the rocky ground below. The remaining 2 men sought cover behind the stone pillars that anchored the bridge. But their position was now compromised. "Nice shooting," Daniel called, even as he returned fire with his own weapon. "Papa always said never aim, unless you intend to hit," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the deadly chaos surrounding them. The narrow confines of the canyon worked both for and against them. While it limited their escape routes, it also forced their enemies into predictable positions and created echoes that made it difficult to determine the exact source of gunfire. Daniel used this confusion to their advantage, firing from multiple positions as they zigzagged across the rocky terrain. A bullet creased his shoulder, tearing through his coat and drawing blood, but the wound was superficial. More concerning was the way Emma's horse was beginning to favor its left front leg. The animal had either stepped wrong on the treacherous footing or caught a bullet in the hoof. "Emma, your horse is limping," Daniel observed during a brief lull in the shooting. She patted the mare's neck, feeling for injury. "She can make it across the bridge, but not much farther." That meant they would have to make their stand on the far side of the canyon, where the terrain offered better defensive positions, but where they would also be trapped if Hartwell's forces managed to surround them. The sound of approaching riders from behind grew louder. Daniel risked a glance over his shoulder and counted at least 4 more men, including Hartwell himself, thundering toward their position. The merchant rode like a man possessed, his expensive coat billowing behind him as he urged his horse to greater speed. "Time to move," Daniel decided. "Can you keep those 2 pinned down while I clear a path?" Emma nodded, already reloading her revolver with practiced efficiency. "Go!" Daniel spurred his horse forward in a reckless charge toward the bridge. The 2 remaining blocking riders rose from cover to meet his assault, their rifles swinging toward him like the maws of hungry predators. But Emma's covering fire forced them to duck back, spoiling their aim and giving Daniel the opening he needed. His horse's hooves rang against the wooden planks of the bridge as they crossed the narrow span. The structure swayed alarmingly under the animal's weight and momentum, reminding Daniel why most travelers preferred to cross at walking speed. Below them, Eagle Canyon dropped away into shadow and mist, its depths lost in the pre-dawn gloom. One of the blocking riders broke from cover, attempting to reach a better position on the far side of the bridge. Daniel's pistol tracked the movement, and his shot took the man's center mass, sending him tumbling over the canyon's edge with a scream that echoed off the stone walls. The last blocking rider, now alone and facing overwhelming odds, threw down his rifle and raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot, I yield." "Smart man," Daniel called back, keeping his weapon trained on the surrendering gunman. "Stay down, and you'll live to see the sunset." Emma's horse made it across the bridge despite its injury, but Daniel could see the animal was near exhaustion. They would need to find shelter soon, or risk being caught in the open when Hartwell's main force arrived. Behind them, the pursuing riders had reached the bridge approach. Hartwell's voice carried clearly across the canyon as he shouted orders to his men. "Take them alive if possible, but don't let them escape. Too much depends on this to allow sentiment to interfere." The merchant's words confirmed what Daniel had suspected. Emma's capture was crucial to something larger than a simple human trafficking operation. Whatever Hartwell's buyers in San Francisco had planned, it required Emma specifically, not just any young woman. "This way," Daniel directed, guiding Emma toward a cluster of boulders that would provide cover while they planned their next move. The rocky outcropping offered protection from multiple directions and commanded a clear view of the bridge approach. As they took position behind the stones, Emma checked her ammunition supply. "I have 8 rounds left," she reported. Daniel counted his own remaining bullets. 12 for me, not much for a prolonged fight. "Then we make every shot count." They settled into defensive positions, their backs to the canyon wall and their weapons trained on the bridge. Daniel could hear Hartwell's men arguing about the best approach, their voices carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "The bridge is too narrow," one man was saying. They'll pick us off one by one if we try to cross. Then we wait them out, another voice suggested. They can't stay up there forever. But Hartwell's response was sharp with impatience. We don't have time to wait. The federal marshal in Riverside City is expecting his morning train. If we're not there to intercept him. The merchant's words trailed off as he realized he was revealing too much about his operation. But Daniel had heard enough to understand the true scope of what they were facing. Hartwell wasn't just trafficking women. He was coordinating with corrupt federal officials to prevent law enforcement from interfering with his activities. Emma, Daniel said quietly, I need you to know something. If we don't make it out of this, we will, she interrupted firmly. We have to. But if we don't, he persisted, I want you to know that meeting you again, fighting for you, falling in love with you, it's been the most important thing I've ever done. She turned to look at him, her green eyes bright with emotion. Daniel, Morrison, if you're trying to say goodbye to me, you can stop right now. We're going to survive this, and we're going to build a life together. Before he could respond, the first of Hartwell's men appeared on the bridge. The gunman moved in a low crouch, using the wooden rails for cover as he advanced across the narrow span. Daniel's first shot splintered the wood inches from the man's head, forcing him to retreat. They're testing our range, Emma observed, seeing how accurately we can shoot at this distance. A second man tried to cross from the opposite side of the bridge, but Emma's bullet caught him in the shoulder and sent him tumbling back to safety. The message was clear. Any attempt to cross the bridge would be met with deadly force. Hartwell's voice rose above the sound of wind through the canyon. Miss Whitmore, I'm prepared to negotiate a peaceful resolution to this situation. I'm listening, Emma called back, though she kept her revolver trained on the bridge approach. You're trapped up there with limited ammunition and no escape route. Your horse is injured, and help is hours away. Surrender now, and I give you my word that Mr. Morrison will be allowed to leave unharmed. Daniel felt his blood boil at the merchant's audacity. Don't listen to him, Emma. His word isn't worth the breath it takes to speak it. I know, she replied softly. Then louder. Mr. Hartwell, your word has proven worthless. We'll take our chances up here. Hartwell's response was immediate and vicious. Then you've chosen the hard way. Boys, burn them out. Daniel's heart sank as he realized what the merchant intended. Within minutes, smoke began rising from the canyon floor as Hartwell's men set fire to the dry brush and scrub timber that clung to the rocky slopes. The wind would carry the flames upward, eventually reaching their position and forcing them to choose between bullets and fire. We need to move, Daniel said urgently, before the smoke gets too thick to see through. They abandoned their defensive position and began working their way along the canyon rim, staying low to avoid silhouetting themselves against the sky. The injured horse followed gamely, though its limp was becoming more pronounced with each step. Behind them, the fire spread with alarming speed, fed by months of dry weather and fanned by the canyon's natural wind patterns. The smoke was already making breathing difficult, and Daniel knew they had minutes at most before their position became untenable. Ahead, the canyon narrowed to a point where the walls were only 20 feet apart, close enough that a determined person might be able to jump across if they had sufficient running room. It was a desperate gamble, but their alternatives were rapidly disappearing. "Emma, can you make that jump?" Daniel asked, pointing to the narrow gap. She studied the distance with a horseman's eye for such things. "Maybe, but not with an injured horse." The mare had carried them faithfully through the escape and the firefight, but asking the animal to attempt such a leap with a damaged leg would be cruel and probably fatal. "We go on foot," Daniel decided. "Leave the horses here and try to make it across on our own." They dismounted quickly, gathering their weapons and what little water they carried. Emma patted her mare's neck one final time, whispering words of gratitude and farewell to the animal that had carried her to freedom. The sound of pursuit was growing closer. Through the thickening smoke, Daniel could see figures moving on the far side of the bridge, preparing for another assault. Time was running out and their options were dwindling to nothing. "Together?" Emma asked, taking his hand. "Together," Daniel confirmed. They backed up as far as the terrain would allow, then began their running approach to the canyon's edge. The ground beneath their feet was loose and treacherous, threatening to give way with each step. But they ran anyway, their hands clasped tightly, their hearts pounding with more than just physical exertion. At the very edge of the cliff, they leaped together into empty air, the canyon floor spinning far below them as they flew across the gap between life and death, between captivity and freedom, between despair and hope. Whether they would land safely on the far side remained to be seen. Daniel felt the sickening sensation of free fall as gravity claimed them, the canyon walls blurring past in shades of grey and brown stone. Emma's hand in his was the only anchor to reality as they plummeted through empty air, their leap carrying them across the 20-foot gap with agonizing slowness. They hit the far ledge hard, Daniel's shoulder striking rock as he rolled to absorb. The impact, pain shot through his body, but he was alive and whole. Beside him, Emma gasped for breath, her dress torn and dusty, but her eyes bright with triumph. "We made it," she whispered, as if speaking the words too loudly might somehow undo their miraculous survival. Behind them, across the narrow chasm, they could hear Hartwell's furious curses echoing off the canyon walls. The merchant had reached the edge of the precipice in time to witness their escape, and his rage was palpable even from a distance. "This isn't over," Hartwell's voice carried clearly through the smoky air. "I have connections in every town between here and California. You can't run forever." Daniel helped Emma to her feet, checking her for injuries. She was bruised and shaken, but nothing appeared to be broken. "Can you walk?" "Try and stop me," she replied with a shaky smile. The terrain on this side of the canyon was more forgiving, sloping gradually downward toward a valley where Daniel could see the smoke from distant chimneys. Civilization meant safety, witnesses, and hopefully law enforcement officials who hadn't been corrupted by Hartwell's network. They began their descent carefully, the loose shale and exposed roots making each step treacherous. Behind them, the fire Hartwell's men had started was spreading rapidly, sending plumes of black smoke into the morning sky. The conflagration would be visible for miles, potentially drawing help from unexpected directions. "Daniel," Emma said, as they picked their way down the rocky slope, "what Hartwell said about having connections everywhere, do you think it's true?" He considered the question carefully. "Probably, but corruption works both ways. If he has bought officials, there are others who can't be bought. We just have to find the right ones." A distant rumbling sound made them both freeze. At first, Daniel thought it might be thunder, but the morning sky was clear except for the smoke from the fire. Then he recognized the distinctive rhythm. Horses moving fast, and lots of them. "Cavalry patrol," Emma breathed, hoping to light her features. The sound was coming from the valley below, growing louder as the riders approached their position. Daniel squinted through the morning haze and counted at least a dozen mounted figures in blue uniforms. Federal troops, not local law enforcement who might be in Hartwell's pocket. "Here!" Daniel shouted, waving his arms above his head. "Up here!" The lead rider spotted them and raised his hand to signal the patrol to halt. Through cupped hands, he called up the slope. "Are you the folks from Millbrook Valley? We got word about trouble with a merchant named Hartwell." Daniel felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. Someone, probably Judge Harrison or his father, had managed to get word to federal authorities about Hartwell's operation. "That's us," Daniel called back. "Hartwell's men are trapped on the other side of Eagle Canyon, but he's armed and dangerous." The cavalry captain, a weathered man with sergeant's stripes and campaign medals, gestured for his men to spread out. "We'll handle it from here. You two get down to the valley and wait with the supply wagon." As if summoned by his words, a military wagon appeared on the trail behind the patrol, driven by a soldier Daniel didn't recognize. The sight of official federal presence was more reassuring than he had expected. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt like they might actually survive with their freedom intact. The descent to the valley floor took another 20 minutes, with Emma leaning on Daniel's arm when the terrain became particularly challenging. By the time they reached the supply wagon, both of them were exhausted, but the worst of their ordeal seemed to be over. The wagon driver, a young corporal with kind eyes, offered them water and hardtack from the military supplies. "Captain Rodriguez received a telegram from your Judge Harrison early this morning," he explained. "Something about a federal investigation into human trafficking. The captain's been tracking Hartwell's operation for months." Daniel's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Months? Yes, sir. Seems this Hartwell fellow has been operating across 3 territories, always staying one step ahead of local law enforcement. But the Army's been building a case against his entire network." Emma sank onto a wooden crate, suddenly looking as exhausted as she felt. "You mean this has all been part of a larger investigation?" The corporal nodded. "Hartwell's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. The Army's been trying to gather enough evidence to take down the whole operation at once, rather than just arresting individual operators who get replaced within weeks." The implications of this revelation were staggering. Their desperate flight through the mountains hadn't just been about saving Emma from one predator. They had unknowingly become part of a federal operation to dismantle an entire criminal network. From somewhere up the canyon, they could hear the distant sound of gunfire as the cavalry patrol engaged Hartwell's men. The shots were sporadic and brief, suggesting that the merchant's forces were either surrendering quickly or being overwhelmed by superior numbers and training. "What happens now?" Emma asked the corporal. "Well, miss, you'll probably need to testify at some trials. This case is going to federal court, and witness testimony will be crucial for securing convictions." Daniel felt a chill of apprehension. "Will that be safe? If Hartwell's network is as extensive as you suggest, the Army will provide protection for key witnesses," the corporal assured him. "Folks who help bring down operations like this don't get abandoned to face retaliation alone." A rider appeared on the trail above them, galloping down at dangerous speed. As he drew closer, Daniel recognized Captain Rodriguez, his uniform dusty, but his expression satisfied. "Hartwell's in custody," the captain announced as he reined in his horse. "Lost 2 men trying to cross the canyon, but we got the merchant himself and one of his lieutenants alive." Emma stood up slowly, her legs unsteady with relief. "Is it really over?" Captain Rodriguez dismounted and approached them with the bearing of a man accustomed to delivering both good news and bad. "This part is over, miss, but I won't lie to you. Hartwell's network extends far beyond what we've uncovered today. There will be trials, investigations, and probably more attempts to intimidate witnesses. But you'll be protected," Daniel said, as much to reassure himself as Emma. "You both will," the captain confirmed. "The federal government takes these cases seriously. We've already identified safe houses in Denver and Salt Lake City where witnesses can stay until the trials are concluded." The mention of leaving Millbrook Valley, even temporarily, made Emma's expression troubled. "What about my mother, my home?" "Your mother will be provided for," Captain Rodriguez said gently. "The Federal Marshal's office has a fund for relocating families of witnesses. She can come with you, or she can be protected in place, whatever she prefers." Daniel found himself thinking about his own future, his interrupted law career, the life he had been building in Millbrook Valley. Everything had changed in the space of a few days, and there was no going back to the way things were. "How long?" he asked. "How long before it's safe to return to normal life?" The captain's expression was honest, but not particularly encouraging. "Could be months, could be years. Networks like Hartwell's have tentacles reaching into legitimate businesses, political offices, even other law enforcement agencies. Rooting them out completely takes time. Emma moved closer to Daniel, her hand finding his with natural ease. "Then we face it together," she said simply. The words carried more weight than their casual delivery suggested. In the space of that simple statement, Emma was committing to a future that neither of them could fully envision, bound together by circumstances that had tested them both beyond anything they had imagined possible. Captain Rodriguez seemed to understand the significance of the moment. "There's a train leaving Riverside City this afternoon for Denver. If you're willing to cooperate with the federal investigation, we can have you on it with full protection." Daniel looked at Emma, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her green eyes. They were being offered safety, protection, and a chance to help bring justice to other victims of Hartwell's network. But accepting would mean leaving behind everything familiar, embarking on an uncertain journey that would test their relationship in ways they couldn't predict. "What do you think?" he asked her quietly. Emma was silent for a long moment, her gaze directed toward the smoke still rising from Eagle Canyon. When she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet determination that had sustained her through the darkest moments of their ordeal. "I think," she said slowly, "that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight is longer and harder than you expected." She turned to Captain Rodriguez. "We'll testify. We'll help you bring down Hartwell's network. But I want to see my mother first, to explain what's happening and make sure she's truly safe." The captain nodded approvingly. "We can arrange that. In fact, we'd prefer it. Loose ends make for messy cases, and your mother's testimony about Hartwell's initial approach might be valuable." As they prepared to leave the valley and return to Millbrook Valley, Daniel felt a strange mixture of ending and beginning. The immediate crisis was over, but their real journey was just starting. Whatever lay ahead, trials, relocations, years of looking over their shoulders, they would face it together. The supply wagon began its journey back toward town, carrying two people who had discovered that love could grow stronger under pressure, that ordinary citizens could show extraordinary courage, and that sometimes the most dangerous adventures were the ones that led to the most meaningful destinations. Behind them, Eagle Canyon continued to burn, the smoke visible for miles as a signal that Samuel Hartwell's reign of terror in Millbrook Valley had finally come to an end. But ahead of them lay questions that would take months or years to answer, challenges that would test everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. For now, though, it was enough to be alive, to be free, and to be together. The rest would come in its own time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.